Peter and Paul died in the latter half of the 60s, not the 1960s, but the 60s. 64, 65, 66, 67, somewhere in there. They died in Rome, put to death by the emperor. Peter was the bishop of Rome at that time and head of that Christian community there. And there was a story that was told about Peter that when the persecution was really being fired up against the Christians, that Peter was fearful for his life and fled the city. And as he was on his way out of the city, he had a vision of Jesus walking toward him, carrying the cross. And he stopped and asked the Lord, "Where are you going?" Quo vadis, where are you going? And Jesus said, "I am going to Rome to die, since you will not." And it was in that moment that Peter had that conversion, if you will, a conversion of heart, turned around and entered back into the city, where he was promptly arrested and, as we know, crucified upside down upon the cross in the circus, in one of the circuses, the Circus of Caligula. A few years later, Paul was taken to Rome. They wanted to put him to death in the Holy Land, in Israel, but he claimed his Roman citizenship and said, "No, I'm appealing to a higher power. I want the emperor to hear my case." It certainly put off his execution for a few years, but Nero was not terribly a sane man, and so he didn't listen to reason, and he also had Paul executed, put to death by the sword, having his head chopped off. Both of those men, now their tombs are in great churches in Rome. But we look at how their lives ended with such bloodshed, with such violence, and we say, how can they be victims? How can they be winners? Normally, the world would look at that and say, there is a failure. There is someone who lost, who didn't have a success in mission. Cut short too soon. There's a difference between having one's life taken and freely giving one's life. St. Paul speaks about this in his letter today, where he says, "I am already like a libation being poured out." A libation was a certain kind of offering or a certain kind of sacrifice that was being offered to the gods, or even in the temple, that not only did they offer sacrifices of animals that they burned upon the altars, but they offered libation offerings that were poured out. So you brought your wine, or you brought your oil, you brought these things, and you sacrificed them. You poured them out upon the libation stone. You poured them out so that they couldn't be drunk or they couldn't be used. It was a sacrifice. I'm giving some of my wine to the gods, or to God. I'm pouring out my oil to God. I'm getting rid of this thing that is precious to me. It was a sacrifice. Paul says, my life is a libation. I have already poured it out. I have already given my life. You can't take what has already been freely given. If I give you my pencil, you can't take it because I've already given it to you. If I give you a gift, you can't take that gift from me. You can't steal that gift from me because I've already given it to you. Both Peter and Paul gave their lives in sacrifice. They had already poured them out. It wasn't just in their martyrdom. We don't celebrate the saints because they died violently. We celebrate the saints because they lived a life already dying to themselves. Peter was already sacrificing himself for that early church, for that young church that he was building up in the capital city. Paul was already sacrificing himself having no place to live, constantly on the move, on mission, being shipwrecked and stoned and beaten up and thrown out of towns and you name it, going hungry and starving. He just kept going. He kept giving himself. Because both of these men gave themselves so freely, their lives could not be taken. Their martyrdom is a testimony of the life that they lived. And in that, they showed us Jesus Christ. Peter and Paul demonstrated for the early church who Jesus was by the way they lived their lives. That's why when Peter was being crucified, he said, "Do not crucify me like Jesus. I am not worthy to die like him. Crucify me upside down." And they did. He didn't want to look like he was taking the place of Jesus or that he was doing something more or anything like that. He recognized that it wasn't him that was doing this, but that it was Christ working in him and through him. He gave his life to Christ. He gave his life to Jesus. And so, being poured out, when the emperor took his life, the emperor couldn't take it. When the emperor had Paul executed, he couldn't, because both of them had already freely given their lives. They had already laid them down. Their death was merely an extension of the life they were already living. And in that, they find eternal glory in heaven, because they lived like Christ. We, the church, recognize these two great apostles as being princes among the apostles because of the great witness that they gave. Indeed, all of the apostles gave such great witness, and many of those early saints. When we pray that Eucharistic prayer number 1, the Roman canon, and you hear all of those saints' names that are listed, it's not a random pulling of saints. The saints that are specifically mentioned in that prayer were all of the first martyrs of the church. The men and women who died in that very first century because they lived like Jesus. And so then they were put to death like Christ. And we remember all the way back, this is the blood that soaks down into the ground, that waters the faith of the next generation. And the next generation comes up from that. Jesus prophesied that if the seed wishes to bear fruit, that seed must die and be buried. And then it will bear great fruit. These apostles were extensions of Jesus Christ. And you and I are extensions of them and of Jesus Christ. So I guess the question that faces each one of us today is, have I freely given my life away? I had a wedding here this afternoon, and I stood right there before the bride and groom. And one of the questions that I asked them was, do you come here freely, without coercion, wholeheartedly, to give yourself? He does not take her to be his wife. She does not take him to be a husband until they have freely given themselves. Have I freely given myself in my vocation? Have I freely given myself in my friendships? Have I freely given myself to my husband or my wife or my service, my love? Have I freely given myself? When we freely give of ourselves, nothing can take our freedom away. Nothing can diminish us in any way, shape, or form, because like the apostles, like Jesus, we rise up. We are libations being poured out. You cannot take from me what I am freely given. And that is power, my friends. The world wants to say power is when I can take what I want, but true power is the ability to give. True power is the ability to give, because what is given cannot be taken away. We conquer the world when we give ourselves free. Peter and Paul demonstrate that for us.